And with our label, we also want the text to align to the right. Before we go any further, let's make sure to remember to go over here to our web.config and specify the theme we can use, and that's the default. Just save that. So let's check out how this looks. And one of the things you'll find when creating a user control, specifying a theme in the CSS, is that even when we go in the design mode, we're not seeing the exact layout, and that's another reason for dropping the user control over here on the page. So let's fire up default ASPX, take a look, and we're getting reasonably close to what we want for a layout on the page. Now let's just specify a few properties of some of our text boxes, because some will be longer than others, and we'll give 50 columns for address, and the max length, let's say our database is 50 as well, and we'll do the same thing for address 2, and the max length, and our city, let's make that 35 columns, but potential max length for 50. And the state, let's make the state 2 columns. They have to use the abbreviation for what we're doing, and the max length is 2. Now, another alternative is we could put a drop-down list in here that is data bound to a table in our database that lists all the states, so we'd have a standardized list of states and then use a primary key to store the state value in our address. So that's something to consider. We'll go down to postal code, and let's make this 10 columns with a max length of 10, and we're doing this just as a US-based address. And country, again, let's make that 25 columns, but the max length will make 50. So let's just run the page and view it again to make sure we're getting what we want. And indeed, now it's much closer to what we want. We probably would want to align these labels and text boxes as well. So the next thing we'd like in our user control is to have some standardized validation. So the first validation that we would like is to have the city be a required field. So we'll take a required field validator, and we'll put that out here to the right of the text box, and we'll call that required validator city, and the error message will be city is required, and the text we're going to display in this case is the letter R. Now what we're going to do is give this a CSS class of validation message, and then we need to specify the control to validate, which in this case is txt city. Let's just go over to the CSS and add our validation class, and we'll add 2 things. One is the color, we'll say is red, and we want the font weight to be bold. We'll go back over to our user control, and if we check out our default ASPX, we'll see that it is showing up red and bold as we wanted it. So now we're going to go back and we're going to add a few more validation controls. Let's say we also want the state to be required. So I'm just going to copy and paste the one we use for city and use it with state. However, we need to make a few changes. We want to have it validate the state instead, and we'll call it required validator for state. And we'll just change the message to state is required. We'll just do a few more validations. We can also put required down here for the postal code, make the necessary changes. change the name, or the ID I should say, and the control to validate is the postal code, and we'll just change the message. And the last validation that we're going to use is to put a regular expression validator, and we'll put that on the postal code so we ensure that people enter it in the right format. So we'll just call this regular expression validator postal code, and we'll set the control to validate to be the postal code, and we'll set the CSS class to validation message. The message will say postal code must be in the format and we'll put the error text as R, and the expression, we're going to use one of the canned expressions that we have here in ASP.NET for the US zip code. And I'm actually going to go back to the text and let's put something a little more informative, and we'll say format must be Now we could put more complex validation here if we wanted to, but the key point is that whatever validation we put here in our address user control will be applied consistently across the application or website wherever the user control is placed. Let's just go back to our default page, and what I'd like to do is to get a button so we can post back and test out the validation. And for the moment we'll just put the button here on the page. Let's do a quick test before we leave the validation. Fire up the web page, we'll just click our button to submit, and we do see that we get our validation error messages indicating those fields are required. Let's just put 3 digits rather than a required format in postal code, and we do get the format message. However, you saw that it's offset to the right, so what we need to do is to go back over to our address, and we need to make this display dynamic for the required R, and that means that it'll shift over to the left, or basically that the required validator doesn't take up any space unless it is invalid. Another thing that we might want to do with our user control is to be able to expose some properties that could be set by the container that's using the control. And let's say that we want to have an enabled property for our user control, much like over here on the default page. If we look at the button has an enabled property. Now, by default, our user control will not have an enabled property. So in order to add that, what we need to do is to go down into the code behind, and we need to add a public property called enabled. And to set it and get it, there's a couple approaches, and what we'll do is we'll create a private variable called underscore enabled. It's a Boolean. So we come in here to our enabled property, and we'll say underscore enabled, or rather we'll return underscore enabled, and down here we'll set it.